Thank you very much for being here. It's an honor to be here. It's an honor to talk about two of the most important things in my life, and hopefully two of the most important things in your life. And that is, of course, rock and roll and liberty. Now, my lectures always have subtitles, and of course the subtitle of this one is How Freedom Will Shake You All Night Long. But I've been looking around at this crowd today, and I've been very amazed at the fact that I think that there are a few juvenile delinquents in the crowd. Or there are some people who are up to no good, some juvenile delinquents who might be listening to rock music and going to sock hops and smoking cigarettes in the back. And it's important because I have a message for you guys.
One, 2, 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock, rock. 5, 6, 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock, rock. 9, 10, 11 o'clock, 12 o'clock, rock. We're gonna rock around the clock tonight. Put your glad rags on, join me home. We'll have some fun when the clock strikes 1. We're gonna rock around the clock tonight. We're gonna rock, rock, rock till for broad daylight. We're gonna rock around the clock tonight.
Now, why would I play this archaic song to you? Well, that was from a movie called Blackboard Jungle, which was the horrible movie to frighten everyone in 1954. Time magazine said that Blackboard Jungle undermines the American way of life, giving aid and comfort to communists. And the movie was very mundane. It's about some juvenile delinquent kids, and they sort of oppress this professor, and then he makes friends with them. But they were very scared of what was going on, what was happening in America in the early 50s with the advent of rock and roll, and how that is tied to liberty. And I want to make sure that you guys understand what was going on. We had all over the world, all over the country, we had banning of rock shows, and also all over the world. We had segregationist concerns because it was black music. We have concerns that there were riots breaking out in rock and roll venues. Frank Sinatra, who himself had women throwing their panties at him on a regular basis, had a big problem with this. It is sung and played and written for the most part by cretinous goons and by means of almost imbecilic rhetorication of sly, lewd, and in plain fact, dirty lyrics, and managed to be the martial music of every sideburn delinquent on the face of the earth. Yes, if you're doing it right. But I want to ask you in this America of Leave It to Beaver, this is an American show about the wholesome American family, an America that was so naive that there could be a character called the Beaver on national television and no one would say anything about it. How did we get to this in a span of a few short years, and how does this tie in with liberty? I submit to you that there is an inexorable connection between production, capitalism, and the growth of countercultural artistic movements like rock and roll. I'm going to go over what those connections are. And I submit to you, too, that America in the 1950s, after the war, was the first place, kind of in the entire world. You guys broadly in Europe would catch up, some of you later than others. But it was the first place where scarcity had kind of been conquered. There was a post-scarcity society, there was a baby boom, there were teenagers everywhere, and they had to figure out something to do with their time. This was a period of 1954. The number one hit is Dean Martin, That's Amore. When the moon hits your eye like a big pizza pie, that's amore, right? And in 1955, the number one hit is Rock Around the Clock by Bill Haley and the Comets, the one we started off with. How do we get to this point where we have Elvis Presley gyrating his hips on national television, but they wouldn't show him from the waist down on the Ed Sullivan Show? And T-Bone Walker Try doing that with a guitar, especially with a semi-hollow body there. Playing the electric guitar and doing the splits in a sexualized frenzy that made every American housewife clutch her pearls and make another pot roast for dinner. Here are the factors. First one, wealth. You may have heard it, you may hear it multiple times in this week, but it is a staggering growth of wealth, starting at about 1800 and really kicking into gear. If you see on this graph, America's a little bit ahead of the rest. There were some war problems that Europe had to deal with, which of course kept that lagging behind. Now, what does that mean for our everyday life? We're talking about this all the time. Wealth matters. But yes, we talk about infant mortality rates, and we talk about longevity, and we talk about disease, clean water. All of that stuff is extremely important. But what would have happened, say, let me ask you a question, actually, going back to this slide. It's an important historical fact. So about 20 kilometers here, on October 23rd, 989 AD, a very important historical event happened. Anyone know what it was? What year again? 989. No, it was toil and strife. That's what happened on October 23rd, 989. Nothing. 20 kilometers from here, absolutely, toil and strife. 50 kilometers from here, toil and strife, oppression, poverty. What if you were the best opera singer in the world in 989, 20 miles from here? What did you do with your day? Toil and strife, poverty and suffering. That's what you did with your day. Now, of course, there were art. This fact that we raised 1 billion people out of poverty since 1980 is extremely important. Of course, there was art going on in that time. We had some growth, say between 1 and 1500 AD, about 2 and 3 times. We had world population growth. And so, yes, we had civilization, right? Civilization, the kind of artistic achievements that we think about, came out of that. Well, yes. So like the Hagia Sophia in Istanbul, built in 547, or religious art, that's in the Hagia Sophia. Who was funding this art? The church and the individual people who had money, tithe money taken from them by the church and the royalty. That was almost the entire source of art. He who pays the piper calls the tune. And so the church funded art. It funded choral works, which I'm particularly fond of. It funded things to praise God. Did it fund subversive music that did not praise God? No. And of course, we get into the Middle Ages, the Renaissance, into the Enlightenment, and we do have things like Mozart. Who funded Mozart? Various patrons, Austrian kings, various patrons who asked him to write, say, anthems that were about the greatness of Austria or the greatness of the German people. Same with Beethoven, getting right up to the point that individual people start having purchasing power in their pockets. And so now, if you're Luciano Pavarotti, or if you're Jerry Lee Lewis, you might be able to find someone to buy your records who is not a prince or a church, so you can spread your devil hip-shaking music. And you better do that. He who pays the piper calls the tune. It's Dmitri Shostakovich, one of my personal favorite composers. Spent nearly his entire life in a struggle, almost on a personal level, against Joseph Stalin, who occasionally liked his music and occasionally didn't like his music. In 1943, in the Soviet Union, right after the Battle of Stalingrad, there was a big contest to write the Soviet national anthem. And the two finalists were Shostakovich and Alexander Andropov. Shostakovich, he brought them both up on stage, and he says, well, I think Alexander is a little bit better. And Shostakovich wrote later, he said, I thought that, and he says, and for you, Shostakovich, and he said, I actually thought he said, well, we're going to take you out and shoot you. After Stalin died, he'd written that without party guidance, I would have displayed more brilliance, used more sarcasm, could have revealed my ideals openly instead of having to resort to camouflage. Factor 2, childhood and adolescence. Where would half of you people be today if this was 989 AD? Dead. You wouldn't even be here. We talk about child labor and the horrors of child labor. Go to 989 AD and talk about the horrors of child labor. It's a very simple calculus. What's your productivity rate? How much in a given day can you pull out of the earth for productivity in terms of food? And can that support more than one person? Maybe your parents could pull about 1.5 times their consumption out of the earth. So you're going to have to chip in a little bit, doing the chickens, milking the cows, doing some farming. And of course, that continued into the industrial era. This is an important fact that no one really thinks about. Capitalism and the productivity that capitalism brought invented childhood in a very real sense. It first invents childhood in the sense of playing with your blocks and your dolls when you're 5 or so years old, and then it invents adolescence, and then it invents teenagers, and then it invents 20-somethings who do nothing but, take improv classes and go snowboarding because of the wealth of their parents. So yes, we had children working, of course. But how do we get to the point that the children were on the factories, but they were losing their minds over Elvis the Pelvis Presley? These women clearly need psychological help. How did this happen? These are teenagers. They're not working. They're buying the records. Look at the ship shake. They're buying the records. First time in human history we saw this. First time in America in the 50s, we saw individual teenagers with purchasing power to go to the record store and purchase whatever they wanted. And guess what they wanted? They wanted Elvis. And they wanted Jerry Lee Lewis. We have massive changes in child labor in just 50 years in America. 1900, 1.75 million children between 10 and 15 were earning a living, 1/5 of all children that age. 1/4 of workers on southern cotton plantations or mills were children. Half of them were under 12. Fund a revolution in rock and roll with children working. Your parents are not going to listen to that music. They were listening to Dean Martin and Percy Faith. Here's consumer spending over 100 years in America, where we get an idea of how much they're spending on, say, housing, which has gone up because they're buying bigger housing, but the big one here is food, how much less you're spending on food, and all the other up here, transportation, because actually they are buying cars, so this is not just a cost, and they're getting bigger houses. Also, some of those houses have garages. You can't have a garage band without a garage. This is the fact. This productivity changed the family. It changed the American family first, and then other countries after, and it's still changing in the world, developing world today. The family used to be a method of economic production. That's what it was. You produced on the farm, you sewed in the tenement, you sewed clothes in the tenement, everyone got involved. It was a method of economic production. It turned into a system of economic consumption. And as I said, we have non-working teenagers. The average starting work age was 17.6 years. What were they doing with their time? Necking in the Ford, listening to Jerry Lee Lewis, maybe some heavy petting. Buying records. Who's going to call the tune now? Teenagers. What don't they like? The establishment. What are they going to do? Put their money behind it. Factor 3, technology. This is the Sears catalog. Started in 1888. Started selling cheap guitars. Mail order. It was a massive factor in the growth of Delta blues for African Americans who could go and buy one of these cheap guitars and not have to go into a store that would not serve them. As we said with, go back. Robert Johnson one of the great bluesmen, wrote himself that without the Sears mail order guitar, which he could pay for in installments, he could not have played the blues and pay back it in installments. Leo Fender comes in with a solid-bodied electric guitar. He realizes you don't need to have acoustic amplification of a guitar if you have it running through an amp that's screaming and loud. Massive innovation in 1950, fairly cheap. Another huge one is recording equipment. And this is happening now, by the way. If everyone knows, everything I'm saying here is currently happening with music today. It's become cheaper to record albums. People can make them on their computer, distribute them without record labels. But in America in the 50s, it first came up. Sun Records. This is where Elvis Presley walked in 1954 and says, "I think I'm a singer." And they asked him, "Who does he sound like?" And he said, "Not like anyone." This was a studio set up by Sam Phillips because he could afford a small recording rig and then pressing records. He didn't have to go through Columbia Records, RCA Records, the big ones at time. So he set up an independent record label with technology that had become cheaper due to the factors of capitalism. Immigration and migration, factor 4. Of course, I'm saying that slavery and the forced bringing of African Americans to America was immigration. It's a form of migration, but of course, an input into American music and culture and world culture that is hard to rival. This could be said to be the first rock song. 1951, Roy Brown.
Well, I heard the news, there's good rockin' tonight.
Now, what do you think he's talking about? Anyone? What is he talking about? Okay, we're gonna get a little bit racy here. What does rock mean in these old songs? It's an activity between a man and a woman. Yes, there it is. Everyone was on the edge of their seats, and you finally gave it up. Every single one of these songs is lascivious to the core. Every time you hear rock in one of these old songs, just replace it in your head with the other word. Every time. That song, well, I heard the news, there's a good rockin' tonight, gonna hold my baby tonight as tight as I can. Tonight she'll know I'm a mighty, mighty man. I heard the news, there's a good rockin' tonight. He also had another song called, like, My Baby Likes to Rock. I highly suggest looking it up. It's like, my baby likes to rock every night. Just replace it in your head. It gets really, really dirty. And of course, American housewives were absolutely aghast that you would have such things playing for their teenagers. It wasn't just African American migration, of course. We have Richie Valens, Song La Bamba, bringing in some of the Spanish influences that exist today, like the clave beat in what is his name? In Buddy Holly's. I'm going to tell you how. Yeah, anyway, I'll sing that one later. The clave beat comes a pretty big factor in some of Buddy Holly's songs. And then we have, of course, Hawaiian steel guitar, which is actually the foundation of the electric guitar. The solid body Hawaiian steel guitar, creating the factors to create this sort of crazy mix of things that ends up being called rock and roll. And what does this all mean? As I said, the art of most of human history was driven by the funding of the church and the powerful elite. It turned into an art and a music driven by teenagers, by people who wanted something different and against the powers that be, which is why it always is countercultural. If your parents like what you're listening to, you should probably listen to something else. Fight the power. Now, of course, we have old rockers who come back. Recently, Public Enemy kicked Flava Flav out of the band because he wouldn't endorse Bernie. That is so rock and roll. Or Rage Against the Machine, touring again. for all of their protestations against capitalism, if the socialist system that they want absolutely comes in, they would be sent to the gulag faster than they can say, fuck you, I won't do it, you tell me. And why? And why? Because what we saw with Shostakovich. What does art look like in a socialist world? It glorifies the state, the people, the community. And it's funded mostly by the government or controlled by the government. And how did that work? Because you had real rockers, not people like this who grew up in LA and say, I'm going to be a socialist. But people who were in the Czech Republic or Czechoslovakia, like the Plastic People of the Universe, a great subversive rock band that found time during the Velvet Revolution in '68 to play Velvet Underground songs. And they're still around to this day. The main guy died. That is rock and roll, not what Rage Against the Machine wants. Punks in East Berlin being watched by the Stasi at every moment, still insisting that they have the right to listen to the music they want and that they can purchase it, and they're smuggling it in across the wall. And how did that work?
Но тем не менее, я считаю, что это было в 1957 году, осенью, после школы, мы с приятелем пришли ко мне домой, и он меня озадачил, вытащив пластинку на костях и сказав: смотри, рок-н-ролл, Америка. И я впервые взял пластинку эту мягкую в руки и посмотрел на свет, и я увидел кости.
Знаете ли вы Мурку, дорогую? Помнишь ли ты, Мурка, наш роман? Нас с тобой любили, время проводили.
После этого я поставил эту пластиночку на мамин проигрыватель. Синий проигрыватель, юбилейный, закрутился, и я услышал голос Литл Ричарда. Я спросил у моего приятеля: а кто это? Я был настолько поражен этим экстатическим, вопящим голосом. А потом, через примерно 2 недели, этот же приятель мне говорит: хочешь, поехали со мной к гостиному двору в субботу вечером? Я знаю, там будет мужик, который сам прессует дома эти пластиночки и будет продавать. Хочешь купить? Я говорю: конечно. А Литл Ричард будет? Я у него спросил. Он говорит: да, конечно. И вот мы поехали.
What does he mean by bone records? This was how rock and roll was traded in the Soviet Union before they let them purchase reel-to-reel tape recorders. They would go down to the x-rays, the hospitals, get the x-rays, and then there were people, the 2 people in particular, both who spent time in jail, who would carve rock and roll into these records. I have one. It has Blue Suede Shoes on it. It's really, really bad recording. Barely can hear it. This is how much it meant to them. And even in the United States, which is sort of, I would say, inaugurated or at least built upon this productive capacity to produce rock and roll and the freedom to do it, going across the line there. So, in conclusion, it's very important. The cases for human freedom is as much cultural as it is economic. You're going to hear a lot about economics this week. And they're inextricably intertwined for all the reasons I've said. This machine does, in fact, kill fascists, as Woody Guthrie put on his guitar in 1934. And of course, thank you very much.
1, 2, 3, 4 o'clock rock.